Before superhero games allowed you to accurately recreate your commute to your old job in New York City, they allowed you to experience a SparkNotes version of one of the most controversial comic book stories of all time. You know, the death of a Superman. Released in 1994 for the SNES, The Death and Return of Superman is a single-player beat-em-up that recounts the 90s DC comic of Superman's infamous battle with Doomsday, his apparent death and resurrection, and how he grew a killer mullet in the process. It was developed by Blizzard of Warcraft fame and was published by Sunsoft, who had previously published several other licensed games involving characters such as Batman, Superman, the Looney Tunes, and many others. Around a year after its release on the Super Nintendo, The Death and Return of Superman was also released on the Sega Genesis and was ostensibly the same game, albeit slightly rougher around the edges, with a smaller color palette, and with what looks like a slightly higher resolution. Now, I've always been a bit of a Superman fan. I grew up watching Superman the animated series, the revolutionary Fleischer cartoons from the 1940s, and I'm also a fan of his various live-action film and television incarnations, especially the Richard Donner Superman movie and its various sequels. He's probably my favorite DC superhero, and Christopher Reeve's incarnation of the character is the first thing I think of when I think of superheroes in general. So yeah, you could say that I have some pretty high hopes for this one, and that I was pretty excited to get to play it, especially because the only other standalone Superman game I've properly played before is Superman 64. And while that sounds like a relatively low bar for this game to clear, I'm gonna be honest with you and say that it isn't, because I kinda like Superman 64. Granted, that's mostly for nostalgia's sake and for the kind of reasons why someone might love a movie that's played on Mystery Science Theater 3000 though. But is The Death and Return of Superman worth playing? Because at the risk of spoiling my own review, The Death and Return of Superman is a perfectly fine and playable game, but that doesn't always necessarily lend itself towards being memorable or even worth a cursory glance. But before we continue, a quick, slightly more random than usual question of the day. What is your favorite gaming snack? The treat you can't beat when it comes to gaming and, I don't know, being elite. For the longest time, I'd rarely get seen playing video games with friends without having a bottle of chocolate milk somewhere nearby. Now, whether or not you consider that a snack is up to you, of course, but there's something particularly nostalgic for me about playing through a good game with some Nesquik or Milo on standby. Although, these days I've swapped it out for blueberries due to some chronic health issues that I'm working through. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day over in the comments. I'd love to hear what kind of snacks you guys love to have while you're gaming. And with that out of the way, on with the video. The Death and Return of Superman takes place across 10 levels, which are traversed by one of 5 playable Supermen, and mirrors how several heroes appeared after Superman's death to try and replace him. The characters you get to play as are Superman, Superboy, who's a clone of Clark Kent, Cyborg Superman, who claims to be exactly who his name implies he is, and unsurprisingly isn't, the last son of Krypton, who's also known as the Eradicator, and Steel, who's ostensibly a Superman version of Iron Man.
Are there any other Squidwards I should know about? Meow. I'm out of here.
Each of them play about the same, with there potentially being some differences between them in terms of their speed and damage, but nothing that's particularly noticeable outside of them also having different special attacks and the fact that Steel has the most range out of all of them due to his hammer. From there, it's pretty standard, if not fairly simple beat-em-up fare, with the occasional shmup-style level getting tossed into the mix to break up the action. It's par for the course, but it feels pretty good in practice. Basically, you just go from left to right and mow down hordes of enemies that range from robots to some demon-looking guys, other Supermen, Superman 3 style, and gang members. Normal, non-super gang members. Against frickin' Superman. Some of the levels also feature hazards that you're supposed to avoid, such as landmines, falling debris, or a wrecking ball. What's nice about these hazards is that you can actually use them against some of the game's bosses, which honestly comes in handy due to how simple the combat feels. Let's just get something right out of the way. Streets of Rage, this is not. While that series offers tons of fun and unique combos for each of its characters and gives you an incentive to want to play as one character over another, The Death and Return of Superman makes no attempt to diversify its beat-em-up action outside of the different special attacks and throws that each character gets. The most you get out of this game is the ability to fly at will, which makes disposing of some enemies in the later levels a bit easier, but also doesn't feel that fleshed out. For most of the game though, you'll be using the same basic punch combo or grabs on enemies. This wouldn't really be much of a problem though if the bosses weren't so unnecessarily difficult. And the worst part here is that their difficulty isn't really tied to any fair metric of challenge either, as they usually do little more than stand over you and spam a standard attack.
No, don't like that.
Instead, their difficulty stems from how easy it is to get stun-locked due to the lack of invincibility frames in the game, which is kinda weird when you think about it, seeing as one of Superman's most well-known powers is the superhero equivalent to having a ton of invincibility frames.
Stand back, Lois, I'll protect you.
It really isn't even a problem outside of boss battles either, as none of the other enemies in the game even begin to act as aggressively towards you as the bosses do. For most of the boss battles in the game, all you can really do is brace yourself and spam punches or your special attacks, and then hope that you make contact with them before they hit you first. As far as the difficulty level goes though, The Death and Return of Superman is actually a pretty hard game. While enemies are never that much of a challenge to take down, even in packs, the game's levels tend to drag a bit, which can lead to your lives getting whittled down and you getting a game over just before or during one of the boss battles. I'm aware that this is somewhat to be expected from the genre, but it hardly makes for fair or engaging game design, and leads to the game taking a lot longer to beat than it probably should. Along your journey, you can recover your health and special attacks by collecting different colored Superman crests scattered throughout each of the stages. Superman's classic red and yellow crest refills your special attacks, while a blue one lets you regain some of your health. You can also get an extra life through the ever so well labeled 1-up pickup, and each of these can either be found in a part of the stage itself or behind some of the environment that you can throw enemies into. In fact, by the end of the game, I actually found myself throwing enemies against the wall in every area that I could because of how badly I needed those extra resources. The game's design feels like a bit of a war of attrition because of how many enemies it likes to throw at you towards the end of it. You're expected to go through several screens that have multiple waves of enemies to take on and only get a few health pickups along the way, and frankly, I found it a bit demoralizing. If it weren't for the fact that I wanted to review the game, I probably would have turned it off at this point because of that reason alone. Like, yeah, I'm aware that I should just get good and that Cyborg Superman's gonna destroy the yada yada yada, but there's a literal Brady Bunch intro of other super people out there. Ask one of them to figure it out. I'm tired of constantly fighting this megalomaniac Terminator wannabe, and I need a vacation. I don't have anything against long games or games with long levels, but after a while, I just felt like this game wasn't doing enough to keep me engaged. I should probably take a step back here and clarify though, since it might sound like I didn't enjoy The Death and Return of Superman. I actually did, and had a pretty good time playing it. It's just that I had some issues with the game that prevented me from having as good a time with it as I could otherwise. For example, even though this is also a convention found in multiple other beat-em-ups, the inability to sprint here really slowed down the action for me. As opposed to being able to quickly dart from one side of the screen to the other and, feel powerful as you clothesline an enemy or something, we're instead stuck doing this smug walk that looks like it's straight out of The Office. Likewise, there were also really fun shmup style levels in the game, but I only remember one of them having a boss battle in it. And that's a shame, because these levels were genuinely great and did a good job of breaking up the main style of gameplay. So despite the fact that half the boss battles in this game are already with Cyborg Superman, I would have actually loved to see a boss battle or level that revolved around chasing and battling him in the sky. When it comes to visuals and presentation, The Death and Return of Superman receives solid marks, despite some obvious room for improvement. What's on display here is all quite well done and clearly represents what it needs to, but also feels a little plain for my liking. The game's color palette features a number of different shades and tones for detail, as well as some dithering here and there to get even more mileage out of the hardware, but stops short of being what I'd consider to be vibrant. While this was probably an artistic decision to bring the game more in line with the colors used in your average Superman comic from the time or make it look a bit more realistic, it doesn't particularly work for me and comes across as a bit dull. There also isn't much, if any, use of the Super Nintendo's sprite rotation and scaling effects, which feels like a missed opportunity. Now, as I said at the beginning of this review, this game did also come out on the Sega Genesis, so that may have had something to do with why those effects weren't used in this game. And while it's a missed opportunity, I can't really hold it against the game if that's the reason why. Despite that, the in-game sprites and environments are all fairly detailed and easy to decipher. Each of the Supermen also have well-designed sprites and different animations, which help give them some defining characteristics. It also certainly helps that each of these characters were well designed in their source material to begin with, as they unmistakably look somewhat like Superman, but also look like their own characters at the same time. Except for Steel, due to him being a man in a mechanical suit that looks nothing like Superman, and for Cyborg Superman because he's a straight-up imposter.
You look like Superman.
Oh, cool. Yeah, right on. Well, he was the original, right? So.
The original what?
Anyway, I'm also a fan of the cutscenes in the game that play between each level. While they obviously compress the events of the death of Superman and the subsequent reign of the Supermen story arcs from the comics, they do a good job of keeping the player in the loop about what's happening and are pretty detailed from an art point of view. I can't give them too much credit though, as the character portraits of each of the characters get recycled multiple times, which cheapens their effect a bit. On some level, I think I would have preferred if they went with in-game cutscenes with text boxes, similar to how RPGs handled things, but whatever. Overall, the death and return of Superman's visuals get the job done. While they don't do much that I'd consider straight up impressive, the game clearly illustrates its environment and characters, and the inclusion of cutscenes between each level is appreciated. I know I said I would have preferred this game to be more vibrant and stuff, but that's honestly just my preference for how I like my depictions of Superman to begin with, so it doesn't really factor into my thoughts on how the game objectively looks. And the same goes for the game's music, which is mostly solid, if not a little bland. There's nothing inherently wrong with the music of the death and return of Superman by any stretch of the word. It's just not the best superhero soundtrack on the console. In fact, it actually sounds more like something you'd hear on the Sega Genesis, if I'm being honest. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but something about the specific sound font and the different tones being used in the game just feels like it fits in with the Genesis's typically grungier sound palette.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
While the music lacks some of the Superman punchiness that one might expect thanks to the Christopher Reeve movies and some of the other popular media for the character, what's available here is appropriate for the visuals, gets the job done, and definitely works. I'd hardly consider it the game's fault that it's adapting a darker story in the Superman saga to begin with, and that the bright and triumphant John Williams fanfare is so synonymous with the character and doesn't fit the game itself. Plus, what's available here is good, even though it doesn't do a great job of conjuring images of the Man of Steel for me. Still, it just would have been cool to hear the character's iconic fanfare on a Super Nintendo, or potentially even cooler to give each of the different Supermen a theme that tried to feel like royalty-free knockoffs of the song. I actually think that would have been pretty fun in execution, seeing as each of the Supermen in the game are ostensibly just RC Cola Superman to begin with. So is the death and return of Superman worth playing? While it might sound like I didn't like this game and don't consider it to be worth anybody's time, I actually totally recommend it. There may be a number of better 16-bit entries in the genre, but I still think this is a fun, relatively short game, and that it honestly holds up as one of the best Superman titles to date. It's got detailed graphics, a decent soundtrack, and a seemingly endless horde of enemies that are mostly Cyborg Superman for you to take down. And despite the fact that the game has its fair share of things I would have preferred were done a bit differently, what's on display here is all solid and a lot of fun to play through. Is it the best Superman game I've ever played? Probably, but like I said earlier, I have a weird relationship with Superman 64 that I might have to cover in a future video. What I can say though is that this game is absolutely worth a look, even if a loose copy can go for a bit more than I think it's personally worth. Still, if you're a Superman fan, you can't go wrong with picking this one up for your SNES. And with that said and done, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you haven't answered the question of the day yet and are feeling up to it, I'd love to hear your answer over in the comments. On top of that, if you have any games you'd love to hear my thoughts on in a future video, please feel free to let me know in the comments or over on Twitter or Instagram. You can check out my profile on both of those sites by following the link in the description or by searching for NichePlays on those respective sites. I hope you enjoyed this video, and that if you decide to play through the Death and Return of Superman for the first time, or just decide to play through it again, that you have a good time doing so. So yeah, bye.